We're having another session in our series on White House communications, and today we have two guests, one of whom is here, the other of whom we hope will show up. David Sanger is the person we're waiting for. He's a New York Times White House correspondent. He's one of three correspondents who regularly cover the White House for the New York Times. And Alexis Simendinger covers the White House for National Journal. And Alexis, how long have you been at National Journal?
Since 1997.
And before that, she was with the Bureau of National Affairs. And when she was at BNA, she did a lot of work on economic and financial questions. So she brought a particularly good, I think it's just a particularly good expertise to the White House, because in the end, in the White House, everything involves money. And so if you have a good sense of economic issues, then you're going to be able to look through the budgets and all their different policies for what the implications of them are. And so tonight we're going to discuss with the two of them issues related to covering the White House. And so let's begin with you, Alexis.
Stand in for the New York Times.
In your reporting, when you think of your beat, what do you see as your beat?
Well, let me explain a little bit about National Journal first. I put some magazines along the aisle because I wasn't sure that a lot of students see it. It is so horrendously expensive that it goes mostly to a Washington circulation. It's a nonpartisan weekly magazine about policy and politics. And you probably get it in your libraries, or maybe your professors have assigned it from time to time. But as a nonpartisan weekly, our task at the magazine, and I have a partner covering the White House beat, Carl Cannon. His dad is going to be part of Martha's series later on. Lou Cannon covered the White House also. We have a kind of, I would say, a luxury at National Journal in that we don't do, we do not have to do what David does for the New York Times, which is what they call the body watch, or trying to follow every single thing that the president does. We have a luxury of being very selective about what we do, because we're not trying to replicate what you can get for 35 cents or 50 cents when you buy a newspaper or you're watching the evening news. What we're trying to do is a little bit more in-depth, and oftentimes we're not married to what's fine with our audience, in the sense that hopefully we're trying to explain or forecast something that may be happening in Washington. And like I said, we have an audience that is willing to pay all this money for this magazine to mostly gather information they think they need to do their jobs, to do business in Washington. So at our magazine, it is not necessarily editor-driven, and by that I mean that the reporters at National Journal, it's a small staff, but we have a luxury of being able to monitor our beats and often determine very much for ourselves what the nature of the news is coming out of the White House, the president, or the presidency itself. And some of us have had experience covering the Hill or executive department, what we think we need to cover, and our editors are more or less very they're very aware of why that system works well for our magazine. And we have weekly staff meetings on Fridays, and as a team of reporters, our whole staff talks about what's in the news, and we sort of plot a course for what we may be wanting to do. But David will tell you, I think if David were here, he would say that he is also very selective and very informed about what should be in the New York Times, but that the place that the New York Times serves in the news media is entirely different than what National Journal does, and in some ways significantly weightier, in that they're the newspaper of record, not just in the United States, but they drive television coverage, and the New York Times also drives what's in the international press to some extent. And so David, who has a real expertise in international reporting and international affairs, offers that value to his audience and his partners on the White House beat. And then they also do all the traveling with the president. They all divide up the trips, and they do almost all of them. He would have to say if there's ever been a trip, a presidential trip, that they have decided not to do. but I would be surprised if that were the case. And so there's a real selectivity on the part of the way we cover the White House. We can be very interpretive on that, but I would say that an events drive, for instance, for like the New York Times, much more than the news.
Example of a kind of article that you did, which done two of, one early in the evening and then one later on, with the piece it did on executive order. And that kind of piece, I think, that that one thinks influential, and the kind of work that you tell us something.
Well, one of the things that I cover, let me just back and say, I cover the White House. Here's our time man now. I speak the last year of President one of the Clinton years. And one of the things that observing the beat like to do, look at how presidents flex their executive muscles. How do they interpret the power that the Constitution gives them and their feeling of how to work with the other branches of government? And so early on in Bush's, this current president's term, good evening, my dear.
How are you?
One of the things that was pretty clear was that this was a president who, even though he was working with very supportive members of his own party in Congress, wanted to make sure that he was flexing his muscles very, I would say, aggressively, assertively. And so very early on in the term, National Journal, we decided to do a story about the president's executive authority, how he interpreted it, what he was doing. And this particular administration's hope or desire to, in some ways, make the executive branch the much more dominant branch of government, even though they're supposed to be co-equal branches. And then later on, we came back to that in another iteration of the story when we were talking about Bush's record. So we did it very early when he was newly president, and then we came back and we re-examined the question of how he had used his executive muscles to do a whole series that we did about Bush's record. And this was an election year series that National Journal did, looking at the president's performance and achievements on a whole host of issues. And we, by that time, had a lot more evidence to talk about how it was working, and in some instances it worked dramatically well for the president, and others not. And then, of course, when I first was doing the story, we weren't really, we couldn't really have forecast what the whole ramifications of preemptive war would be, and the president's interpretation of his muscles in that regard. So those are the stories that Martha's talking about, and that's the kind of analytical, kind of in-depth sort of reporting that National Journal tends to be known for, more than the excellent and timely news reporting that David does.
Good evening, David.
Sorry to be late. I was up on the hill watching John Bolton get beaten about the head and arms and face by various members of the Senate.
But we were talking about coverage of the White House, and Alexis was talking about what she brought to it. Her work from BNA had a sense of economics, and to the beat you bring a knowledge of foreign policy as well as economic policy. And how have they benefited you in terms of grabbing hold of the White House as a beat?
Well, the great thing about covering the White House is it gives you a perspective about how the world lands on the president's desk. And that is to say, trade-offs that are made that you may never see when you are covering, or never really fully grasp when you're covering, an individual subject matter, as deep as you may go into that. So, for example, just to pull two here that two different areas that Martha discussed. One of the reasons that the president, we believe, has not leaned on the Chinese terribly hard about letting their currency float, and thus gets at a major issue of their competitiveness with imports coming here, is how much he has needed them in the talks over North Korea to sort of run the six-party talks on getting North Korea to disarm. When you're covering economics, as I did for many years, and I was in Asia for many years, you understand intellectually that there's some place where these all come together. When you cover nuclear weaponry and strategic issues, you understand that there are trade-offs made. But really not until you come to the White House do you really see what happens when somebody sort of has to come in the door and say, you know, Mr. President, before you put the screws to them on the currency, a critical issue during the campaign, for example, you might want to think about what happens when they just let the North Korea talks go on and on and on and on and on. So it has a nice roundness to it. What you give up at times is depth, and the way that we deal with that at the Times is that we have 3 people who cover the White House out of a Times bureau of about 45 reporters and about 15 or 20 additional staff and editors and so forth. And those 3, we try, we all have to cover everything. Somebody's got to be, one of our rules is whenever the president is traveling, one of us has to be with him at all times. So my colleague Dick Stevenson is down at the ranch today where Prime Minister Sharon was. I went to Rome last week when he went for the Pope's funeral. And Elizabeth Hugh-Miller, who also writes our White House letter column, travels with him a fair bit. Dick is very steeped in economics, and we covered economics together for a long time. He was doing mostly domestic and the Fed, while I was doing globalization and international economics. Elizabeth has been a political reporter for a long time, covered the City Hall in New York immediately before she came here. We've all been foreign correspondents. Elizabeth's been in India and in Japan. I was in Japan and traveling all around Asia for 6 years. Dick was in Great Britain and traveling around Europe for a good deal. And that, I think, is a very important background to have because it raises your threshold level, particularly on foreign policy issues, for when the president says something that you know isn't going to fly elsewhere in the world. You have an immediate instinctive sense of what's going to work and what isn't. It may be a wrong sense, but at least you have one. And that's, I think, an important element of the background.
Recently, you were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize on your piece on nuclear proliferation. How do you get into that and do that as well as the regular White House coverage?
By juggling a lot. I've had a long time interest in nuclear issues. Goes back actually to my time goes back to things I studied in college, and then in Japan. I wrote some of the first stories in the late 80s and early 90s about the North Korean weapons program. And around 2003, began to argue within the paper that we needed to devote very serious resources to A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani nuclear scientist who, the more we unwound on the North Korea program, we began to realize had been the main supplier to North Korea for their second nuclear program, which is one that's based on uranium. It was a secret program that they ran to sort of evade an agreement that they reached with President Clinton on to freeze their plutonium program. And so I organized a team with the help of Bill Broad, who's one of our science reporters who I've worked with years ago on the Challenger investigation on the space shuttle, the first space shuttle that exploded. And we brought in a number of other foreign correspondents. And that's one of the great things about the Times, which is it's got the depth of a university. I mean, you can sort of reach into the science department and get the person who's sort of best for that and reach into the Foreign Correspondence Corps and say, gee, we think a node of this network is in South Africa. And suddenly you can begin to, get people moving around the world. And so we put a lot of time and a lot of effort last year into a whole series of stories, probably more than 20 or 30, on the way the Khan network operated. And that's what made it to finalist, but not beyond in the Pulitzer world last week.
What kind of impact do you all see that in your writing that it has after a story comes out? What are some of the impacts that they have?
I think at National Journal it's a lot more atmospheric than it is concrete because it goes to such a small, somewhat educated audience of people. So to some extent, those people who are interested are self-selecting, and I think that the ramifications tend to be, well, you always tend to hear from the people who don't like something about the work first and foremost before you hear something positive. But I think you tend to hear both. I think, from the White House beat, it's not just what you write, but I think it's also, to some extent, because it's a small group of people paying attention to what makes up the White House press corps, it's a small group of people paying attention to how you work, not just what you write. And I don't know what David thinks about that, but I think they pay attention to how you conduct yourself, the kinds of stories you're interested in or you pursue. They're a pretty savvy group, so they pay attention not just to the audience that National Journal has, which is important to them, but also to the extent of what they think of the caliber of the reporters doing the work may or may not be.
I think that's right, and Alexis's publication is read by a very elite group, and it tends, as a result, to have an important repeater effect because it helps sets a tone about what is perceived on an issue, and you'll see that repeated, probably often unattributed, but repeated. We also have a repeater effect. It's of a different kind because we have a broader audience, but on some subjects we'll go in as much depth as National Journal, but not as often. And of course, we're out every day. Our first repeater effect is on television, which is to say that news producers, probably more often than they should, look at what's on the front page of the New York Times in the morning, and that frequently determines what you see on the evening news at night or what you see on cable or so forth. It shouldn't always, because sometimes it's just substituting our news judgment for their news judgment, and there's no particular evidence necessarily that ours is that much better, but that is the way the world is. It becomes an agenda setter. And we try to use that to some good effect in our reporting, which is to say that you can go to people in the administration and say, look, we're writing on X subject. I know you'd prefer we didn't, but we are. That's life. And you can try to ignore it if it's something they don't want to go deal with. But you can say, look, the story's going to come out, and come tomorrow morning, you're going to get asked about it at the gaggle in the morning, which is the early White House description, at the briefing, maybe by other reporters if it's a big story. Maybe the story will get completely ignored. You never know. But my argument is, if you're going to respond to it in the same news cycle. Be in our story. Answer our question. Because it's not going to do you a whole lot of good to ignore us today and then get asked on the record, by a half dozen people. You won't be able to ignore it tomorrow. The corollary to that rule is, if you don't call us back by 6 or 7 in the evening to answer our questions, that's fine. There's no law that says you've got to respond to a reporter's inquiries. But if you choose not to respond at 6 or 7, don't come complain at 10 in the next morning when you're barraged by questions that we didn't fully represent your view. We will go out and do our best to make sure you understand exactly what it is that we're writing, get your response, you have a chance to influence it. But if you pass up that chance, know that you have passed up that chance.
Did they understand that coming in?
No, no administration understands that coming in, and has to be reminded of it on regular occasion. And, sometimes I've gotten phone calls at 10 o'clock the next morning, and somebody will complain about a story, and I'll say, that was a really interesting explanation, and I would have been delighted to put it in the piece. And if you go back and look on your desk, there's probably a little pink piece of paper saying, we called last night.
Can I also just add, as somebody who covered all the fun-filled years of Bill Clinton, that they often, for all their faults in communications, could be much more effective at recognizing that, I think, and being responsive, because they did not have such a hierarchical communications organization. This is my own experience. speaking here, and that this administration is so top-down oriented in the way they have designed their machine to deal with communications, however effective it may be, it is very slow and cumbersome. And I say that as somebody who's writing for a weekly, so I have absolutely no idea the horror of it for David, who's trying to deal, with the hour-by-hour, evening deadline. But, my deadline comes around every week the same day, which is Wednesday, and I'm telling you, here we are in year 5, and it's still hard to get them to really recognize it comes around the same day every week. And, it's a weekly. I've given you some lead time, and I've tried various not tricks, but techniques to move that machine, try to move it with more speed to be responsive. And some of it is, it's the kind of common sense you think of. Let me help them understand why this might be useful to them to participate. Or let me threaten them why it would be really bad if they didn't cooperate. And I just find that this is an administration that is, they're slower learners, and they have a very top-down orientation. It's driven by the president's desire. That's the way he likes it. He thinks it works for him. He was reelected. Who am I to argue? But I think that they oftentimes are so slow or so reluctant, it's at a detriment to them.
Let me give you a very concrete example of this. 3 weeks before the election, President Bush was told in his morning intelligence briefing that the Iraqis had reported to the International Atomic Energy Agency that a very large cache of conventional explosives was missing in Iraq. They had gone down, it was gone. And this stuff had been under seal by the IAEA, not because it was a nuclear weapon of its own, but because this is the kind of explosives that you pack around a nuclear warhead and to trigger the conventional explosion that then can be used for a nuclear explosion. It can also be used for many other things, conventional bombs and so forth. And we had gotten a hold of the documents that had been conveyed from the Iraqis out. And we knew that this was going to be a sensitive story coming at the time it was, which was just before the election. And we were at work on it. And the Wednesday before we published it on a Monday. And actually, we were forced into print because it was beginning to leak a bit. But 4 or 5 days early, I had gone to very senior members of the administration, and we had gone to very senior members of the Pentagon and said, look, this is what we have. We've got a team of people working on this. We were sending people down to the site in Iraq, got shot at on their way in and out, as you can imagine. We were working on a fairly lengthy story on it. I think when finally published, it was 3,000 or 4,000 words. And we knew it was going to be sensitive just because of the timing. We said we want the fullest explanation from the Pentagon that we can get this time. And we were basically ignored. And the Sunday, the day before it ran, I had to call some senior people in the administration and say, you realize the Pentagon still hasn't gotten back to us. We've been asking you every day. And, there's this big train that's on the track, and it's coming down, and it's nearly at the station, And the Pentagon spokesman called back with a not very full. Clearly, they had done nothing with it on Sunday night, and they spent, as Alexis will recall, the next week, which was the week before the election, coming up with differing explanations about how this had happened. Their first explanation was this wasn't new. We said, well, if it wasn't new, why was the president briefed on it? He really gets annoyed if you go in, the CIA briefers tell him things he already knows. Then they said the stuff was probably gone before the Americans arrived in Baghdad, so it wasn't our fault. Then somebody found some TV tape that showed that, in fact, it was there 3 weeks after the American invasion. Then they came up with somebody else in the Pentagon with another explanation. My point about this is they could have gotten their story all together when we told them about this for 3 or 4 days. And for whatever reason, they chose not to.
Do you think that there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans in the ways in which they deal with information? The Republicans, if you go back to the Reagan administration, the Nixon administration, and probably even the Eisenhower administration, they developed plans for what they wanted to do, what they wanted to talk about. And as long as they can talk about what they want to talk about, everything is okay. But when other things come up, they have difficulty dealing with it.
Well, Democrats, bless them, are much less disciplined,
Yeah.
and
And less
it's a more
hierarchical.
fractious
Yeah.
party, and the result is you'll get a lot more disagreement. Now, there are many things that the Clinton administration never told us. They tended to be more about Bill Clinton's personal habits than they did frequently about the kind of issues we've been discussing here. But, what I noticed in the early days of this administration, and be interested to see if Alexis ran across the same thing. During much of the Clinton administration, I was covering globalization issues, and you'd go into the Treasury and you'd say, so how come you guys made the decision you did? And they would pace you through it and say, look, here was the situation, and we were trying to affect it, and we thought 51-49, we had a better chance of affecting it if we made this decision. You could write that down, you go through the debate. The early days of the Bush administration, I would go in and ask, on an economic issue again, well, tell us why you made the announcement, the decision that you made. And they would look at you and say, well, we did it because it was the right thing to do. Did it because it was the right thing to do. They did not want you to get into the internal process. And that held together pretty well through 9/11, maybe a year into it, and then fell apart as soon as many questions began to arise about what wasn't working in the war on terror, and then really fell apart in the intelligence on Iraq. And I just spent the afternoon listening to John Bolton go through, minute-by-minute events of, well, there was a disagreement in the intelligence community between the CIA and the State Department over the meaning of this piece of intelligence. Well, we all know these kind of debates go on every day. In the Clinton administration, we tended to know about them contemporaneously. In the Bush administration, you only find out about them after the fact, if you find out about them at all.
Let me just add to that by saying, in my mind, it's so simple because Democrats actually philosophically like government, and they're so proud of what they're doing to solve your problems. This is just the way Democrats think. Republicans think government should have a limited role, and in this particular administration, what I was told when the President Bush first came in was, it's about the president, it's not about us. So to talk to the policy experts or to try to get them to unwind how they got to some particular deliberation or what the meeting was like or how many people were at the meeting or any of that stuff, they were not encouraged. I would say they were aggressively discouraged from talking about that. So they didn't want reporters to really do process stories the way we were doing about Democrats, because Democrats tend to be so interested in exulting over the expertise and the thoughtfulness and the various individuals, and there was never any really clamp down on who could talk and who couldn't talk. And as David aptly says, even if they had tried, they would have failed horribly. And I've had Democrats tell me who worked for Bill Clinton that they have admired in some perverse way what the Bush administration has been able to do and wished, in retrospect, that they could have been able to do it, knowing, of course, that they just didn't in their DNA have the capability of really harnessing the machine and telling everyone, you work for the president, the story is about the president, it is not about you or this policy or how it unraveled. And also, hilariously, if you ended up talking to Clinton people, and this is something that's going to get so down in the weeds about reporting, but oftentimes for us to write a good story, we're trying to tell a story. We're trying to find, David is very good at this, at finding the kind of anecdote or color that will explain so that you will understand how did the president think or who was involved or what does this involve, how does this affect you. The Clinton people were really good at that. They could really understand that, and they would be able to pull that stuff out of their kit bag and give it out like candy to the reporters. And here's the color. They knew what color was. If you talk to President Bush's people about color, like, give me some color, how, the conversation or who said what or what, some dramatic thing that happened, they just look like, and then they will give you something thinking that that's color, and it's just so hopelessly pallid and gray and boring. I don't know, has this happened to you when you're just like...
Only every day.
Can we work a little harder at this anecdote? Or it's the same anecdote that they've just given to 5 other news organizations, which really doesn't help you, because you want to tell a story, but you want to tell some kernel of the story that David doesn't have. So the one other anecdote I wanted to offer about something that just would illustrate how sometimes this administration is slow is a story that David did. To their unending regret, the president spent his Christmas vacation and David was along. And unfortunately, a horrible natural disaster occurred, the tsunami. And in my appreciation, it took David Sanger to point out to this administration that, you know, this is a whole part of the world that's been affected, Islamic part of the world, that we could really show our good side as Americans. And David, my impression, because I was not in Crawford, tried to like ask the kind of questions that, right, do interviews that would sort of, like, what are we doing, how are we going to do this? Well,
where is the president?
Where is the president? Why haven't we heard from him? Why isn't he embracing us? Well, Martha's question is a good one, because if it had been President Clinton, and this is partially the explanation why supposedly President Bush didn't do this, if it had been President Clinton, we would have seen him morning, noon, and night, feeling the pain of every tsunami.
He wouldn't have been in
and
Crawford.
we ended up seeing him, actually. We did end up seeing him, but if he had still been president. And President Bush supposedly reacted like, you know, he's not a microphone seeker. He wasn't going to get out in the first blush. You know, information was still coming in. It was not that the administration wasn't doing anything, but they didn't want to harness the information to explain what the administration was doing. And as a result, the taxpayers their generosity went from like a drop, which was what President Bush initially talked about with his aides, to $950 billion. So it just went like this huge, with two presidents getting involved and this huge ratcheting it up, and then the administration realizing how slow they were to react, and just in terms of the communication part, not the aid part. So I just point that out because David wrote this really good story from Texas, and I thought it educated everybody in the administration, and they sort of then got the drift.
Well, I'm not sure how much of this had to do with me, but it does, this whole question of the internal process tells you about what works on this and what does not. Because it's a great theme to say, this is all about the president, and we're not going to tell you about the process, when things are going well. When something falls apart, like, say, the intelligence about Iraq, and you come back to them and say, well, we haven't seen any of the process, so we assume that the rule still applies, right? It's all about the president. He was the one who got all the intel wrong about Iraq? Well, wait a minute, you know, and then you back up, and suddenly you're beginning to hear stories about disagreements, and the CIA had it wrong, and had we only known, and this and that. And so one of the difficulties that this administration has run into, as all do, I think, at times, is if it's all about the president in good times, it's still about the president in bad times, and at that moment, the dam gets unleashed, and they have to go find a reason to explain that it really wasn't about the president in this particular case.
Mm-hmm. When you're thinking about a White House story, what do you think are the basic elements that have to be in it? What is it important for the public to know about what the president is doing, what he's thinking, or what's going on, like in, say, in the tsunami case?
Well, some news breaks. The really interesting news oozes, okay? A breaking news story is pretty evident. You know, the EP-3 planes are shot down over China, or forced down over China, not shot down. The president's got to go respond, and the question is, how does the president respond? But to my mind, some of the most interesting questions are things that the president doesn't respond to, doesn't talk about all the time. Tsunami would be one interesting case. I mean, I knew from my time in Asia that people in Asia were going to be looking to see what the president was saying, even if they couldn't fully understand the English, you know, that they wanted to know that somebody was out there caring about them. That was something I think this White House took a while to get at. They might have done it faster had it not been Christmas week and had they been in Washington. Think how much we all focused, how many headlines you saw on the nuclear threat, the biological threat, or the chemical weapons threat of Iraq, because the president was out talking about it each and every day. And when the president talks about it, we have no choice but to sit down and write it and write stories about it. Mm-hmm. Think how little the president has said about, in public, about North Korea, which we believe in the past year has probably put together the fuel for 6 to 8 additional nuclear weapons. Has a huge chemical weapons stockpile, we believe, probably has some biological as well. Or Iran. Or a couple of countries that are suspected of having programs that the White House has not discussed. And the President hasn't discussed these as much because they don't have a plan as much about what they can go do about it. You don't get out and rev up a crisis if you don't have then a very solid way of going to deal with it. And so what I see as a good part of our job is to go deal with those things that we know are on the President's desk. We know from talking to people elsewhere in the administration, from people who come in and talk to him, from talking to the intelligence side, and so forth, but that he's not speaking about every day. And then explain why it is he may not be talking about it.
When the White House isn't talking about something, then where do you go for information?
This is a White House where you report from the outside in. You know, you go to members of Congress, you go to people you know in the intel world, you go to diplomats, you go to foreign diplomats, you know. If an ambassador is having dinner with the President, the Secretary of State, the Vice President, whatever, and they spend 2 or 3 hours discussing how to deal with Iran, and the President isn't talking about it, well, it's a pretty good idea. They're pretty well focused on that issue inside the White House, even if you're not hearing much public commentary on it.
And I think one of the things that makes this administration challenging is that President Bush, since he was a young man, son of a president, absolutely despises leaks and does not like, he enjoys the surprise. He likes to control information, and personally, he just absolutely can't abide it. So one of the things that they do, for good or ill, is that they like to keep their circle very close in terms of who they talk to. It's not as easy as in past administrations to gauge because they don't consult as much. So David is right, you know, you try to talk to the Hill, you try to talk to the advocacy groups or their special support groups or the business groups who are allied with the President and share his interests, because you're trying to gather those radar soundings. What is he working on? What are they thinking about? And particularly, we're dealing in a time right now, at the beginning of the second term, where there's dissent. There's actually disagreement among Republicans, so it's so much more fun to go out and talk to those who have differing points of view, because they're a little bit more willing to sell their point of view in print. But this administration makes what David's talking about somewhat challenging, because they like to keep their circle so close, and there's nothing that makes the President happier than to see that he's really skunked the press corps on something, an appointment or a personnel pick or something like that. So as I think Martha's getting at the idea that reporters will always go somewhere to get the information, some version of the information. And what I would argue is that there are some things that this administration's been very good at keeping secret, but that is hard to do over 8 years. And so to some extent, I think we're watching the President be what he thinks of as slightly more transparent, just in the sort of superficial way, which is, for instance, he's doing more news conferences, which Martha's turned into a whole specialty area scholarship.
Little cottage industry.
The cottage industry, her study of and accounting of. The President has met with the press corps for some long, extended period of time, at least once a month since he was elected, as Martha's pointed out. He just did that on the trip back from Rome.
From Rome, he did 45 minutes of sort of free association on his
Took any question
religious views, Social Security.
Absolutely, ran the gamut.
Where he was going to be fishing this weekend, you know, everything.
Do you see a difference in him as the second term begins?
Yeah, much more relaxed. A man who recognizes that he's not going to be running for re-election again, and therefore can sort of let his guard down and actually let you discover a little more what he's thinking about.
Do you think that goes for the staff as well? That the staff was reluctant to, say, make recommendations during an election period of things like doing press conferences in case something didn't turn out, and they would then be blamed.
I think they're reading his signals. They're a little more willing to take some risks. But I think that the biggest issue that comes about, and this happens in many second terms, Democratic and Republican, is that discipline falls apart in a second term. First terms are all about the loyalists who got the president elected being in position. In the second term, there are still loyalists who are in position, but some people have burned out, gone home, gone back, gone on with their lives, and so you begin to get appointees who did not necessarily come up through Texas with the president, did not necessarily go through the fire of the 2000 election, and therefore don't have as deep a roots. Or you have people who did all of that and have gotten alienated in some way or another.
One thing that occurs to me that was, I think, noted by Al Kamen this week, that the Office of Global Communications seems to have just died. And that was part of their communications operation. In fact, it's the one thing that they had added to the White House communications. It was issued by an executive order to the president that they were going to create this office, that they were going to carry the message forward throughout the world. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing just simply falls apart. Do you have any idea why that happened?
My cynical response to this is that it fell apart when it was created, actually, because it was an enterprise invented by Karen Hughes, who was at that time the president's communications minder, counselor, and but her specialty was communications. Her title was counselor, and she in the run up to the Afghanistan war strike and Iraq, felt that the White House could control or help to control the message in terms of speaking to the rest of the world. And she got this idea with Alistair Cooke, who worked with Tony Blair, and they Alistair Campbell, who worked for Tony Blair, and set up this shop in London first. And at any rate, it was just a propaganda office, really, in terms of the good news, and they devolved into sending out pitiful little emails and
every night, right?
Every night,
Two of them.
That were mostly, as I recall, excerpts from the president's speeches that day.
Yeah.
Yes, and other commentary.
And then they had the Iraqi fact of the day.
Right.
Yes, they had the
So
two things.
I would say that the impact of the office, however much we thought of the people who worked there, or we didn't think about them, that they may have been competent people asked to do something that was ridiculous and impossible, and they ended up shepherding guests in for photo ops and things like that with the president. And so my attitude toward it is, who cares? Because it didn't have any real effect. It was not successful. But interestingly, we will have to see what Mrs. Hughes' invention will be at the State Department, because she's now in charge of a similar enterprise for the entire United States of America at the State Department. So we will see what she's invented.
Yep. What do you all get out of the gaggle and the briefing? These the daily on the record sessions that the White House gives. Is there anything in them that's important?
The briefing, zero. Gaggle, some.
Yeah, I think that's about right. And when I travel around the country, I'm astounded by the number of people who actually think that this thing that they see on C-SPAN has anything to do with White House reporting. You know, the briefing. I find I go for three reasons. One is there's just the logistics of knowing what's going to happen to your life. That, you know, the president is going to such and such a place Thursday and Friday, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, I've got to go get organized for that. The second is to raise a question to see if there's a sensitivity on the administration's part. In other words, something that you have reported out separately, and then you ask a question to find out if the press secretary knows anything about it, or if there's a stock answer, which you may want to be using later in the day or later in the week to contrast with what you believe from your other reporting is actually going on. The third possibility out of it is that you are trying to determine whether or not a subject is not only sensitive, but that the White House, in its evasions about it, you know, suddenly have come to the conclusion that they need to go deal more with something. And I can't tell you how many times I've raised a question gently about something in the briefing, and I've gotten no answer to it, and then the phone will ring 2 hours later from some policymaker who will say, I see you asked about X at the briefing. What do you know about it? And then you're sort of in a game where they're trying to figure out how much you really know. And so it can ring their bells a little bit. In terms of using it to write a story out of, not much unless there's something huge going on, in which, you know, you've got to hear the statement.
Does that happen with the gaggle as well?
I find the gaggle more useful because it's not on camera, it's more informal, it's quicker, and it's usually funnier.
Yeah, it's certainly lower key.
It's much lower key, and it's an excuse to go get your Starbucks on the way in or out. Yeah. So.
The one thing I would add, I don't know, how many of you ever watched the briefing, for instance, with Scott McClellan? You watched? You know who we're talking about then, right? One interesting thing that I try to explain to people covering the White House is that it is an institution in our government that is really colored and shaped by the personality and the strengths and weaknesses of one individual, the President of the United States. And it is surprising how that whole enterprise is shaped and molded around that one person. Scott McClellan happens to be someone who's close to the President and was close with him in Texas. And I find him, just in terms of the theater, the theatrics of the briefing part, to sometimes be a very good barometer of the President's own disposition or feeling about something. So if Scott suddenly gets a little hot and he stands up a little straighter and he starts to get somewhat animated about something, I tend to think, okay, that's because it's touched a nerve with the President, and in whatever context they've talked about it. I'm just adding that because it's just one element. When you've covered a beat for a while, you get to know the personalities. It isn't just an institution. And you try to get to know the people. David knows them very well. He's done so much travel with them. You get to know the rhythms of the place and how the President's personality colors their thinking, how it can drive their day, and what they're interested in either protecting or selling. So that's one other very small marginal value.
That's why that late in the day phone call is so important back, because, you know, they're worried about what it is you're going to print. And so, you know, you can use that later phone call to say, you know, it's up to you guys. I would never put your press strategy together, but if I were you, I would make sure the assistant secretary in charge of so-and-so went and talked us through his memo that we happen to have, or whatever, you know, at that moment. And that it can be useful just for getting them out of their we don't discuss it mode.
Are there people in the administration, like say Bartlett or maybe Scott, who will persuade other people to talk to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If they come to the determination that it's in their interest to go do it. You know, my joke with this administration is they always say they never discuss intelligence, and by and large they don't, except when they do. You know, when it becomes necessary to prove that they weren't speaking, you know, making something up along the way.
Do they complain about stories? And who do you hear from? Alexis?
You'll sometimes hear, in my case, I will sometimes hear, usually not immediately, but it might be you run into somebody later. I mean, we have a long deadline, so we're trying to work with them and trying to get the information right. But you might deal with them on another story. You might hear about them something later. But I can give you an anecdote of the previous administration. You think of nice, straight down the middle National Journal. During the heat up with Monica Lewinsky and everything that was going on, National Journal had two columnists at the time, Michael Kelly and Stuart Taylor. Stuart Taylor writes our legal column for us. And both of them were bashing President Clinton upside and down the other every week, and our columns run in the front of the magazine, and the White House was absolutely livid. And so what I got as the beat reporter was very nice, because I had relationships, of course, you know, fair, accurate relationships with the press folks. But Mike McCurry, for instance, basically said, you'll never get an interview with the president. Why should we help you? And the president's counselor at that time, Doug Sosnick, said the same thing. You know, we like your work, fine. We don't have any problem with you, but we're not going to do you any favors. So they were really straight up with me about, look, you know, this is a really bad season, and we can't stand the bashing that your magazine is doing in those columns. And they made it, you know, very plain. Now, that's a different example. It's not complaining necessarily about anything that I was writing or doing. So I just had to factor that in, and I conveyed that to my editors. We didn't change the way we did anything. It certainly didn't change the columnists in any way, shape, or form. We just went about our business. But we knew that on certain things, we were never going to be on their list of any kind of, you know, help or benefit.
What about you, David?
Well, they have complaints about the New York Times, as you can imagine, almost every day. Now, many of them have to do with our editorial pages, and they know intellectually that the reporters don't write the editorials, don't deal with the editorial writers.
You should tell them how the president feels about the New York Times.
The president's got strong feelings about the New York Times, and his feeling about the editorial page versus reporters is we all get the paycheck from the same place, you know. In fact, I think he's used words relatively close to that at some point. You know, so they've got a fairly strong view along those lines. The missing weapons story that I described to you before, they out and out accused us of trying to manipulate the outcome of the election with the story, you know, late in the time. And, you know, I argued, look, the president was only told about it on mid-October, whatever day it was, and took us a week or two to, you know, sort out this information. They will never, to their dying days, believe that. It happens to be true, but they will think the timing was motivated by the fact that we're the New York Times and it was a story that was embarrassing to the administration and how they handled the early days of Iraq. But at the same time, I think that there are some in the administration who respect the fact that on some major subject matter, we have devoted an enormous amount of time and energy. We have a huge bureau in Iraq, as you can imagine. We put a lot of time and effort and energy into these stories. And some of them will deal with you on that, no matter what they think of your editorial page.
Do you want to tell them the story about breaking the story on the preemption doctrine? The Bush doctrine?
You go right ahead. I'm not quite
you
sure
tell
what the
them.
story is.
No, just about how, you know, how it works the other way, too, that they understand the importance of the New York Times.
When the preemption doctrine first came out, I knew it was in process within the bureaucracy, and was getting ready to go write about it. And they decided in the end that that the New York Times would give it the kind of space that it, you know, and an explanation that it needed, and so we were able to obtain a full copy of it before it was made public. And, you know, they probably weren't entirely unhappy about that, you know, because they had made a decision early on that the Times would deal with it, you know, fully and in some historical comparison.
And then David gets that exquisite experience of walking into the briefing the next day, the morning his story runs, and every other reporter on the White House press corps is there, hands up, trying to, you know, replicate, get reaction, you know, follow the story, and David's sitting there having already written the story. It's a great feeling if you're a reporter.
It doesn't happen all that often. So.
Great feeling.
Do you find that on complicated policies that they're, well, I wouldn't say often, but that's a way that they'll work, that they understand that the Times is going to give it the serious attention, whatever the issue?
It depends. No, it depends on what the issue is. If it's a domestic political issue, I think they'd much prefer to talk to USA Today or something that they think is sort of read more in Red America. If it's a foreign policy issue, I think they'd rather talk to the Times because they realize that their allies, other foreign leaders, you know, the networks, whatever, will be reading the New York Times and looking for our take and our interpretation of it. So I find it's quite bifurcated in that regard.
It's very audience-driven. They're very aware of where the audience for that news is. In our case, for our magazine, we're seeing on the Hill, our penetration on the Hill is fairly complete. So if it's a legislative issue, oftentimes they will feel that that's an audience that they can reach. Now, it's an elite audience. It's not Joe six-pack reader trying to figure out how Social Security reform will affect him or her. It's very much the legislators or the staff. So, you know, National Journal can kind of get an edge on certain issues if we're pursuing something, because we know the White House cares, not every day, but some days, about that audience. And people would argue that they don't care enough, but that they do, and that they can use National Journal to reach that audience.
And if it's regulatory, it may be the Wall Street Journal, and if it's Social Security, it may be USA Today,
Right.
and if it's, you know, electric power, as it was in the first days of the administration, it might be the LA Times. So, you know,
Right.
they're aware of who reads what.
But it's not always. I think we want to make it clear. It's not always that because we're asking, we're getting the service and the response. Because we want to write about a certain issue, that we're getting complete treatment, or we're getting the same treatment as every other news organization. That's part of the game, the wrestling that you do.
And that's one thing that happens from one administration to another, whether
Absolutely.
they're Democrats or
Absolutely.
Republicans.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Also, if you have a good piece of a story, you can use that to get leverage
Right.
elsewhere. You know, we had their first proposals the first time in June when they decided that they would actually make a serious proposal to North Korea, and we got it because we had gotten it from other allies, you know, outside the United States, many of whom had originated the idea and pressed it on the administration for a long time. And at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I went to them and said, look, we're printing what we have from your allies, who, by the way, take credit for originating the idea. And there was sort of the, they do what? And so it went from a 2 p.m.,
Remember,
we're not
it's all
commenting.
about the president.
Right. We're not commenting on that, to a 4 p.m., can you be over here in 15 minutes? You know, and so you use information you get elsewhere to.
Right. Yeah. One has an idea of White House officials as having this very long day where they start out, you know, at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd like to see what kind of day do you all have? How
We
do you
don't start
put
at 5 in the morning. At least I don't. Maybe Alexis does.
No. When I first came to the White House beat during the Clinton administration for National Journal, one of my predecessors had been totally exhausted after doing the beat for some period of time, and desperately wanted to write about something else, because the Clinton people worked so late in the evening that in order to effectively cover the Clinton people, you had to put in hours that went, you know, more towards 8, 9, 10 p.m. than say this particular administration. And I came in, and my predecessor had, you know, family, kids, and he just wanted to write about something else. He just was so fed up because the Clinton administration was so disorganized that, you know, or the people you had to deal with, the president's people, were all, you know, working till midnight. In this administration,
Even if they never got into the office before noon.
exactly.
Right?
Well, or even if they weren't producing anything really effective for that 18-hour day. This administration starts early, like all White Houses, but they also, I think, depending on what their job and duties are, they tend to try to make their day a little bit more, surprising to me, a little bit more normal hours. But reporters tend to start their days later and then go later because of your writing deadlines and working on. Now, I already told you we have a weekly deadline, so I get probably more sleep than David does. He has kids. He probably has to juggle a lot of family responsibilities, and he travels more than we do at National Journal, way more, because it's so expensive to travel with the president. I don't know if all of you understand what it costs, but David can tell you it's really, really an expensive enterprise to do it. So I would say the day starts for National Journal, gosh, if you see people, let's put it this way, our staff meeting on Fridays is at 10:15. So we keep a pretty leisurely morning hours. And then it just, whatever the story takes is are the hours that you put in. And I've had people who said, I can't get back to you until tonight, especially when they know you have a weekly deadline, and so, you know, they're going to talk to David in the New York Times before because they know what his deadline is, and so, you know, it very much depends on what the story is.
What do you read in the morning?
I read my own paper just to understand what things have happened since I left the office, or what happened
Or what
to
the
my own
editors
copy.
did to the copy.
Right. I read the Washington Post. I read the Wall Street Journal. Later in the day, I make my way to the Financial Times. Usually to one or two Asian papers online. Could be the Asahi Shimbun in Japan. I try to vary it some. The LA Times, until recently, printed a Washington edition. They don't anymore, so I've got to go do that online. And then, a number of, weekly publications, National Journal included, of course, because I couldn't miss anything that Alexis has written. Those will come more haphazardly or get stuffed into my briefcase, and I read them as, late in the day.
Okay. Alexis?
I would say I tend to read the same, at least a survey, the same national newspapers that David's talking about. I do a lot more domestic than I do international reporting. So, because we have beats set up in our magazine, and we deal with it separately, and my colleagues in the magazine. And then I think it's what you read for the content and what you read for protective purposes. And sometimes there's some great online collators of information, and they'll sort of give you a heads up if you're following a particular issue. Like right now, Social Security, if I'm trying to keep up with what's going on there, I will read one of the internet collators, the political notes or something, and then I will dive into the coverage depending on what it is I think I need to read. And this is saying for the weekly stuff, I read very haphazardly and will dive around, and it isn't a very organized method. But there's what you read for substance and what you read for protection. And then also you pay attention, you're listening. I don't know in your office, but in our office, we have open work areas, and people are yik-yakking about things they've read or what they've heard or whatever. And so you tend to try to follow a little bit in conversation, because we have reporters who are reading different things, and we have a small staff, so we'll sometimes share that way.
Internet filtering is great, because you can have things dropped into your email that are on a certain subject matter that you're following.
Well, let's go to some questions from you all. Let's take a question from Towson first. Anybody there?
Hello?
We can hear you.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay. My question's for, I guess, Mr. Stanger, and it's about the John Bolton. I was wondering what's your take on whether he'll make it out of the Foreign Relations Committee, and if that happens, on the full Senate. And then what's your view or the New York Times take on, is he the right person for the job?
I won't answer the second question, because as a reporter, I don't have a take about whether he's the right person for the job, but I can certainly describe his strengths and weaknesses. On the question of Congress, it seems right now in the Senate, or at least in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to come down to Lincoln Chafee, who's a Republican in Rhode Island, a very blue state. And he is the one who is most likely, it seems, to break out of the Republican Party consensus on this. If he stays with the Republicans, then by one or two votes, he'll get out of committee. And I think once out of committee, he'll make it through the full Senate, most likely. If he breaks, then I think the committee will freeze up, and his name would not make it out. Right now, we don't have any evidence that he is going to defect from the party on that, but he's clearly still undecided. Look, John Bolton is one of those rare wonders in the Bush administration where you know exactly what he is thinking. Okay? You may or may not agree with it. You may think, as his critics do, that he has either skewed intelligence to fit his preconceptions, or that he has pushed the intelligence beyond where it should be. his views on the United Nations, particularly before he entered the administration, are abundantly clear. He is the man who said that you could lose 10 stories of the building without any loss. And I read a wonderful quote, not in the Times, last week when I was in Europe, from somebody from the UN who said, well, you know, he didn't say which 10 stories, so we might have room for negotiation here. It's a really interesting strategy to put somebody who was a huge critic of the organization in as your ambassador of it. One argument that some in the administration make to me is that if you do that, you have diffused those in the Republican Party who want to cut off all the funding to the UN, who want the U.S. to pull out of the UN and so forth, by saying, look, we have taken and put at the UN somebody who is really dedicated to changing the way it operates. To me, that sounds more like an ex post facto explanation than a rationale for why he was initially chosen. But it's going to be an interesting test. It's an interesting test of, can the Republicans keep things together at a time that they're having a hard time on the Hill on domestic issues, starting with Social Security. It's going to be a test of whether or not the Democrats can put together a consensus on a very different worldview of how you go deal with international organizations.
Yeah, I saw you before.
Firstly, I wanted to ask.
Do you want to say where you...
I'm Stephen Israel. I'm from UC Santa Barbara. My first question was, what are your feelings on Matt Drudge? And my second question is, you talk about those daily White House briefings with Scott McClellan, and you say that you're amazed at how many people think that has anything to do with writing about the White House. What I wanted to know is, I didn't hear much about the different way that the White House is covered in print and on television, and if those kind of sound bites play a bigger role in television, and how that affects America and America's sense of what's going on in the White House.
That's a super good question. I think that the answer I would give is that as a scribbler, a writer, it saddens me to say that most Americans get their news and information from television, and that just is the truth of the way our community of news consumers works. I was also interested to look at a study that the American Society of Newspaper Editors had commissioned, and young people, 18 to 24, by and large, only 40% of them would say that they look at a daily newspaper every day anymore. And so the whole culture of reading newspapers, something that makes me feel like a fossil to say that I grew up with looking at newspapers, is really dying out, because younger people are drawn to the internet. It's easier. You can get your information that way. The way that the White House relates to television, I think David was suggesting this, and I was saying something similar before he came in, which is that the White House is very oriented to where the audience is, and very, very organized around television, and that's been increasingly true of the modern White House. So this particular administration is very savvy. They actually hired former television news people to work for the president inside the White House, thinking about the pictures and how they present their story in terms of the images and the content for television. And when David says that his newspaper can drive what television covers, the White House is also very knowledgeable about how television, how much time they have, and how they'll cover it. Certainly cable has added a whole 24-hour news cycle to the way that the White House is aware that television, network versus cable, covers the White House. And interestingly, my understanding is that Drudge, you asked about Drudge, Drudge absolutely plays zero role in my reporting world unless he's got something, unless I hear through the grapevine. I mean, I just forget to read him. I just don't read it. But I know that White House officials have said that they do look at Drudge. Drudge is also the recipient of interesting information from time to time. So if I just have to be one of these people who hears that something is on Drudge, but I don't go to it regularly. I don't know if that goes to part of what you're saying, but David, I'm sure you have experiences.
Well, I'm sure if you're a television reporter, the briefing is more important because it does give you a daily visual. If you can't get anybody else in the administration, and frequently you can't, to stand up and talk about something, you can at least ask about it at the briefing, and you'll have some kind of answer to put on TV. That's more important to them than it is to us. I mean, if we only had the briefing twice a week, it probably wouldn't make that big a difference in how we operated, because we're spending most of our day either on the phone or in person with other people in the administration, and I don't need to put their picture or necessarily their voice, and sometimes not even their name, if it's something that you can only get on background, into the paper. We try to get more and more on the record as we possibly can, but there are some subject matters, particularly in intelligence matters, where people simply won't talk about it that way.
And you usually explain why. You try to offer that to the reader. Why they can't be named.
We describe, and under our rules, we have to describe why something can't be discussed on the record or why somebody declines to speak something on the record. And frequently there are times when you see administration officials try to hide behind that, and you have to say to them, look, can you give me one good reason we can't have this discussion on the record? But for TV, if there isn't that visual, then they're left with their White House reporter, many of whom are very good, to sort of stand up in front of the lawn and try to describe all of this. Alexis said something about newspaper reading versus TV watching and so forth, and she's absolutely right, and the numbers all show this. If you took the half-hour broadcast of a network TV show and you set it in type and you put it in the New York Times, I think it would take up about 2.5 or 3 columns of one page. And we publish 120 to 150 pages a day, and then the Sunday paper is, its own behemoth. So you're getting quantitatively an entirely different thing. What you're getting qualitatively, we could all sit here and argue all day. But to my mind, it can't be a substitute. TV is a headline service by and large, except when they go in and do in-depth pieces, as you frequently see on, Frontline or 60 Minutes or some other format.
Tomorrow night, by the way, and not to give a plug to PBS and Frontline, but they have a special on Carl Rove, if you're interested, tomorrow at 9 p.m.
He was our guest last
And Martha had him as a guest.
Yes, he was a guest last week. Towson, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. This is for both of you. How do you think the Clinton administration and the Bush administration handle scandals differently when they break in terms of press relations?
Well, I would say, from my experience, that I thought that the Clinton people, by necessity, got particularly good at doing that quite a quick pivot to harness all the talent that they had in their universe to try to deal with scandal. And that could be congressional investigation. You have to remember the Clinton administration faced an active opposition party and lots of investigation, a completely different scenario than what this president has had to deal with in terms of dealing with the Washington oversight. This administration, I would say, is very, very good at long-range planning and really bad at anticipating. And what I mean by that is that as talented as the people are who work for the Bush administration, I think that they are repeatedly slow at understanding that the nature of what they know every day, which is that events happen. I mean, the world just happens to them, and they have to forget about those flowcharts and long-range plans that Dan Bartlett comes and talks to Martha about, his months and months of planning in terms of their communication calendar and how they've got it all set, and they're going to run Social Security like a campaign. Well, stuff happens, and they're very slow, in my experience, at pivoting to deal with it. And part of it, my feeling is because they have this top-down hierarchy which requires the entire universe of Team Bush to get together and decide that such and such has to happen. Now, that's not true of every instance or every issue, but they're very slow. In the Clinton world, because they allowed the Clinton people working for the president to own certain portfolios of responsibility. They were responsible for them, and the president assigned them to do it. Those people would just marshal their forces. They were an army that acted intuitively, very quickly. They would make decisions on the fly. They would work together as small teams, and that turned out to be very, very effective for the president in the second term, when the White House had to literally bifurcate itself, and the communication operation that dealt with policy and governing was over here, and the operation that dealt with scandal literally was walled off over here. You know, not the ideal for U.S. government, but because they were able to do that, the president survived. He survived impeachment, and he went on to finish his second term.
I think that's exactly right. And you've not seen, unfortunately, maybe these days are behind us, you haven't seen the kind of scandal surrounding the president's personal life in the Bush administration that you saw in the Clinton administration. And of course, the response of how you deal with that versus a policy scandal, which is to say, say defaulting intelligence, is completely different. The Clinton administration could be extraordinarily effective at trying to blunt, deny, change when it dealt with the president's own personal troubles. I was a bit player in the story that announced that President Clinton was going to reverse his previous statements and testify when he finally did testify on the whole Monica Lewinsky case, that in fact that he did have a relationship and so forth and so on. I remember watching the briefing the next morning as I was out of town but saw it on TV, as they tried to respond to our story and not want to confirm what they all knew to be true, which was the president was in fact going to admit to the affair. So they had their moments when they had a hard time pivoting as well. This administration does not respond as quickly, and the example that I frequently cite on this is the 16 words issue. Who put in the President's State of the Union address those 16 words that Saddam Hussein had sought uranium in Africa, that became, the running subject and sort of the first big break in what went wrong in our intelligence. And I remember going to a very senior member of the administration when we started up a big investigative team on this. And I said, look, there are two ways that this can go on. I said, we can sit down and have the conversation and pace through how this got into the State of the Union speech, because every State of the Union speech is annotated down to the last nth degree. And we can go back over the intelligence on it, and we can go look at the National Intelligence Estimate that dealt with Iraq and on this subject matter, which at that time was still classified. And this person said to me, look, we just can't do it, it's classified, it gets into this whole range of things we can't discuss. And I said, we come out every day, and my suspicion is the drip, drip, drip of us and everybody else on this subject is sooner or later you're going to end up declassifying this. And a month later they did. Yeah. But it took them a month of bleeding every morning on this subject matter until they finally came around to it.
And I had the
National
same
Guard records too.
Yeah, I had a similar experience dealing with the President's Council, talking about whether Dr. Rice would appear, not testify, but appear in some way, shape, or form before Congress to talk about what they knew about 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. And sat down in an interview, long explanation about how this was never going to happen, why this would go against precedent, blah, 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 blah. And, having this candid exchange, and I was saying, this is going to end up happening. This is going to end up happening. Let's talk about, why and what could she, talk about, et cetera. And it did. It ended up happening because of the nature of Washington, and they can dig their heels in. But eventually, there's more to be gained by trying to tell your story from the very get-go, because one way or the other, someone's going to tell it for you.
Do you think that because everybody they have a sense of responsibility for what they're supposed to be talking about, they've got a message that they're supposed to be carrying out. And what happens with that is that sometimes it makes it difficult to listen. And one of the cases kind of that goes along with this is the whole issue of corporate responsibility. That Enron, the whole Enron thing began in 2001, but it took until July of 2002 before the president spoke. And that somehow they just didn't get a sense of how important this issue was going to be, that it took so long. And that one reason might be is that everybody was just so busy telling people, telling reporters and others what they wanted them, what message they wanted to get out. But at the same time,
also there was the embarrassment factor that some of the key players in it, including the chairman of Enron at the time, or chief executive of Enron, was an old and dear friend of the president,
Right.
and as I recall, was the chairman of the inaugural committee in 2001. And that might make you a little less hesitant, a little more hesitant to get out and denounce the company from the podium.
Yeah.
But I think, Martha, you're getting at something that's really important in terms of the administration's dealing with a world that thinks, they believe, thinks like they think. And in Washington, with Republicans in power in both the House and the Senate, and in many of the state houses around the United States, there's the White House thinks it's an enormous advantage to be absolutely talking to your own kind or singing to the choir. And I think that may be politically very advantageous, but sometimes it leaves you, as Martha's somewhat suggesting, flat-footed because you're not anticipating what I was trying to suggest about the Clinton people, as horribly disorganized as they could be about certain things. They could anticipate one thing, and that was that there was an opposition party or those in the opposite camp who absolutely were going to fight the president tooth and nail on whatever particular policy or direction. In other words, he wasn't always going to get his way. And so their ability to anticipate, to plan, was to know that if the opposition reacts with this step, then we have plan B, and then we have plan C, and we have plan D. So what I'm saying, and what I think Martha is important, is that when you live in a culture that thinks like you think, you oftentimes are ill-prepared for the dissenting voice or the thing that goes wrong or the unanticipated event that doesn't go quite your way. And that's why I was suggesting that the second term is more fun to cover, because things start to unravel a little bit. The president loses a lot of his clout, even if he doesn't want to admit it. There are dissenting voices that start to emerge. There's 4 years of history. We just get tired of our presidents. That's what happens. We get fatigued with sort of everything they're doing. And second terms can be just great news stories for all the reasons that you've heard about or read about as far as American history. But just from the point of view of a reporter, they can be just so much more interesting.
Question here? Let's see. Yeah, in the back, young woman back there. Yeah.
Two questions, sort of interrelated. First of all, do you ever find yourself trying to reconcile your own political beliefs with your duty to neutrality, and do you have problems with that as a reporter? And then also, how do you feel about this new blogging phenomenon, and how is that going to affect media, or how has it already affected media and news today?
Did you say fun? Do you have fun trying to reconcile? Problems. I couldn't hear what you said. Well, it depends. I would say that by and large, I don't find any difficulty reconciling whatever personal opinion I have, because it may seem hard for some people to grasp this. I think as a reporter, I try so much harder to be accurate and fair, try to get a variety of a wide spectrum of information so that I can feel that the story is complete, as opposed to feeling like my key goal is to be objective. Now remember, National Journal's an analytical magazine. We are straight, we're nonpartisan, but I'm also trying to provide enough information to the reader that it's not just a story on the one hand or the other hand, that you can help a reader make up their own mind, but you're providing the information that you believe they need to get a complete picture. So it isn't really necessarily about my own particular point of view. It's what does a reader need to know about this issue? And the blogging phenomenon, I think it has limited utility as far as I'm concerned. But I understand the power of it, and I think it offers us a lot of challenges. We, in the what we call mainstream press, it offers a lot of challenges going ahead, going forward. I'll give you a small anecdote. I was just in a small wrestling match by email today over a question that you guys would not even understand really. But when pool reporters travel with the president, there is an assignment to write a pool report that's supposed to be shared among our colleagues. It is like looking at someone's reporter's notebook that we share among White House press corps. Well, there's a new and troubling phenomenon. This is just one small thing. Of these pool reports being transmitted to those who don't cover the White House, they're not reporters, they're not journalists, and it's entering the sort of mainstream thinking in terms of blogs or the internet or gossip columns, Wonket, etc. And I find that just appalling. It is absolutely a dangerous thing. I do not think reporters' notebooks should be transmitted for the American public to read, because that is not what they're designed for. They don't offer context. They're internal discussions among a particular, members of a craft. So that's just one instance of this constant appetite to be able to disseminate information just for the sake of disseminating it and not really taking into any context what the role of a journalist is. So that's my little soapbox about blogs. Journalists who do blogging, I think, provide a different layer of thinking to some of their blogging. That is a different question, but just the drivers out there who can force a CBS, maybe that was valuable, maybe that forced a very slow daily media to get more aggressive, but that's not always necessarily the best effect of what that constant push to be first, to be faster, to investigate is necessarily really about. But that's just my opinion.
David?
Well, first, on the question of political influence, bias, and so forth, I'm in complete agreement with Alexis. Your training as a journalist kicks in much more than in writing an individual story than anything else. So you're looking to see that you've represented both sides and so forth. Do we do that perfectly all the time? Of course not. And this will take us to the bloggers in a minute and how they dissect our work. But I'm not concerned in writing an individual story that you can't make it fair. I mean, today with listening to Bolton, we can make sure that we get his critics in, we get his answers in, and all that. Where it comes into effect is in much more subtle ways, which is your selection of stories. And that's why you want to make sure that in a newsroom you have as diverse a group that you can. You want it to be ethnically diverse, you want it to be gender diverse, you want it to be background diverse, you want it to be politically diverse. So that something that strikes somebody else's news might be something completely different than what strikes me as news. Because I don't think, while I think you can compensate for your own political beliefs, left, right, or center, in an individual story, it's harder to do it with the subconscious question of selection of story. To the bloggers. There is some utility in this. I mean, I think that knowing that there's a group out there that's bird-dogging what you're doing makes you more careful. And I have at times been found making mistakes by blogs, by other readers, and we get out and try to correct those. If it's almost irrelevant whether it's pointed out on a blog or a letter to the editor or a phone call. You want to make sure that you're doing it as accurately as you can. Where blogging worries me is in two different arenas. The first is blogging and journalism are very different things. Blogging may be a ground-eye view up of a particular incident. Let's take aside the question, and I'll deal with that in a moment, of the political orientation of a blogger. But it is a narrow view that does not have behind it the kind of investment that we make in making sure that the readers of the New York Times are getting a big, broad picture. Most bloggers cannot afford to keep a bureau in Baghdad. okay, so that we can have our reporter in Washington on the phone in the morning with the reporter in Baghdad and trying to figure out whether or not the policy that's being described here bears any resemblance to what's actually being executed on the ground. And the bloggers have an answer to this. We don't need all that. All you guys have is a bureau sitting near the green zone where your reporters are scared to go out in the streets. We can have a blogger who happens to be a sergeant who is sitting, in a tank somewhere, and he'll give you a much better view of what's really happening on the ground. Well, he might in his particular area, and on some specific incidents, that may be right. But what you're getting is a series of anecdotes instead of a look at where things are happening. And what's happening in Mosul may be very different from what's happening in Baghdad. And you're not getting the kind of training in knowing what it is you're looking at. The second thing you're not getting is you don't know the orientation politically of the blogger. So you don't know what's going through his filter. Now, on that issue, you might say that we're all even, but I think in a general news organization, you have, years of reputation to go look at, and people can decide whether they believe it or not. The overall denunciation of mainstream media I find interesting, because when I write a story, I have found many days you can get denounced by the blogs on the left and the right for the same story. I have gotten letters or seen on blogs, he's in the pocket of the White House from the left, and from the right on the very same story. Can you believe he has the audacity to challenge whether or not the White House is telling the truth about this?
Well, I'm afraid our time is up, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.